March 1966, Nashville, Tennessee. A cafe called the Blue Bird on Church Street, 11 in the morning. A man named Ray Holloway is sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee he has not touched, and the woman behind the counter is telling him, for the second time, that he needs to leave. Curtis is 54 years old. He does not look 54. He looks older in the way that men look older when the years have been assembled from the wrong materials. Too much weather, too little shelter, the particular aging that comes not from time alone, but from what time has been spent doing and where it has been spent doing it. His coat is a Korean War surplus field jacket, olive drab, faded to the color of old grass. His boots are cracked at the left toe. His hands, wrapped around the coffee cup he has not touched, are the hands of a man who has worked outdoors for most of his life and has not worked at all for the past several months. He came into the Blue Bird at 10:55 because it was cold outside and because a woman on the street had given him $1 and told him to get something warm, and because the Blue Bird's door was unlocked and its lights were on, and the smell of coffee and bacon grease coming through the door was the smell of a place that contained, at least in principle, the possibility of warmth. He sat at the counter. He ordered coffee. He put the $1 on the counter. The waitress, her name was Patrice. She was 23 and had been working the Blue Bird for 8 months and had been told by her manager what to do in situations like this, had brought the coffee. She had then gone to the back and returned with her manager, a man named Gerald Foss, who was 41 and ran the Blue Bird with the efficiency of a man who had a lunch crowd to prepare for and no interest in complications. Gerald Foss had looked at Ray Holloway at the counter and had made the calculation that managers of certain establishments made in Nashville in 1966, when a man who looked like Ray Holloway sat down at their counter. He had told Patrice to ask the man to leave. Patrice had asked, politely, in the tone of someone following an instruction she was not certain she agreed with. Curtis had not moved. He had wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and looked at the counter surface in front of him and had not moved. Gerald Foss had come out from the back himself. He was telling Curtis for the second time that the Blue Bird was a family establishment and that they reserved the right to refuse service, and that Curtis would need to take his $1 and go, when the door of the Blue Bird opened and 2 men came in out of the March cold. Ray Holloway had not served in the Army to be asked to leave a diner. He had served at Heartbreak Ridge in 1951, which is a name that meant something specific to the men who were there and functions now as a geographic designation on maps of North Korea, but which was, in the fall of 1951, a series of hills that changed hands 19 times in a month and a half, and took from the men who fought for them things that could not be itemized on any discharge document. Curtis had come home in 1952 with a hearing loss in his right ear, a scar on his left forearm from a piece of mortar casing, and a recurring problem with his sleep that the Army had not had a name for yet, but that the men who experienced it knew intimately. He had worked. He had worked as a laborer, as a farmhand, as a dishwasher, as a night watchman at a textile plant in Murfreesboro that closed in 1963 and took his last steady income with it. He had a brother in Knoxville who had offered him the couch more than once. He had declined more than once, for reasons that had not changed since the reasons first formed in him. A pride that was not vanity, but something older and more structural. The kind of pride that is less about self-image than about the specific way a man has learned to understand his own existence. He was sitting at the counter of the Blue Bird on Church Street with his hands around a cup of coffee, and Gerald Foss was telling him to leave, and he was not leaving because the $1 was on the counter and the coffee was in the cup, and he had done nothing wrong, and he knew it, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He did not look up when the door opened. "Where are you watching from?" Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Elvis Presley was 31 years old in March of 1966 and was in Nashville for a recording session at RCA Studio B on Music Row. He had been in the studio since 8 that morning and had come out at 10:30 with his road manager, Red West, because Red had said there was a place on Church Street that did good eggs, and Elvis had not eaten since the previous evening, and good eggs sounded like the right answer to the specific hunger of a long morning session. They came through the Blue Bird door at 11, and the first thing Elvis registered, before the counter or the menu board or the smell of the coffee, was the quality of the silence in the room. It was not the ordinary silence of a cafe in mid-morning. It was the particular silence of a room in which something uncomfortable is happening, and the people present are managing their awareness of it in the careful way that people manage awareness of uncomfortable things. By not looking directly, by finding other surfaces to examine, by allowing the event to proceed without the acknowledgement of witnesses. Gerald Foss was at the counter with his back to the door. Patrice was behind the counter with her eyes on the coffee machine. The 4 other customers in the Blue Bird, 2 at a table by the window, 2 in a booth at the back, were looking at their plates or their cups, or the middle distance with the focused attention of people who had decided not to be present for whatever was happening at the counter. Curtis Ray Holloway was at the counter with his hands around his coffee cup, looking at the counter surface, not leaving. Elvis stood at the door for a moment. Red West, behind him, understood what was happening approximately 2 seconds after Elvis did, which was fast enough, because what Elvis did next he did without a pause long enough to suggest deliberation. He crossed the Blue Bird to the counter, pulled out the stool beside Curtis Ray Holloway, and sat down. He did not look at Gerald Foss. He did not look at Curtis. He picked up the laminated menu from between the napkin dispenser and the sugar, and he looked at it the way a man looks at a menu when he is deciding what to have for breakfast. Gerald Foss turned from Curtis to Elvis. The recognition, when it came, arrived in the way recognitions arrived in Nashville in 1966. Not immediately, because famous people in ordinary clothes, in ordinary establishments, were not what the brain prepared for. But within a few seconds, and with the specific quality of a recognition that changes the architecture of a situation without anyone having said a word. He said, "Mr. Presley, good morning." Elvis looked up from the menu. He said good morning. He said it pleasantly, without edge, the way he said most things. Then he said he would have the eggs scrambled with bacon and a coffee, and he gestured at Curtis beside him and said his friend would have the same. Gerald Foss looked at Curtis. He looked at Elvis. He looked at Patrice. Something moved across his face that was not quite shame and not quite calculation, but had elements of both. He said nothing. He went to the back. Patrice looked at Elvis, and then at Curtis, and then at her order pad. She wrote something on it. She went to the pass-through window and called the order back. Curtis Ray Holloway had not moved. His hands were still on the coffee cup, but something in his posture had changed. Not visibly, not in any way that a photograph would have captured, but in the way a body changes when the situation it has been braced against is no longer the situation it is in. The tension that is not a pose but a preparation, built over years of knowing what rooms do to men who look like him and have what he has and don't have what he doesn't. That tension had shifted, not gone, but shifted. He looked for the first time since Elvis had sat down, sideways at the man beside him. Elvis was looking at the counter, waiting for his coffee. He was not performing anything. He was not displaying generosity or making a demonstration of principle. He was just sitting at a counter in a diner on Church Street in Nashville, waiting for scrambled eggs and bacon and coffee, the way a man sits at a counter when he is hungry and has come in from the cold. Red West had taken the booth at the back. He was looking at the window. Patrice brought the coffees. 2 cups, set down on the counter in front of the 2 men without comment. Curtis looked at his cup. It was the same cup he had ordered himself, the same coffee he had not touched. But it was different now in the way that the same things are different when the context around them changes. When the room that had been moving to remove you has stopped moving. When the counter you were about to be pushed off has become the counter where you are simply sitting having breakfast with someone who sat down next to you. He picked it up and drank. Elvis drank his coffee. He asked Curtis, after a moment, if he had been in Nashville long. Curtis said a few weeks. Elvis asked where he was from originally. Curtis said Cookeville, up in Putnam County. Elvis said he knew Cookeville, had driven through it many times on the road between Memphis and various points east. Curtis said it was a good town. Elvis said it seemed like one. The eggs came. They ate. The conversation between them across the next 20 minutes covered, according to the people who were told about it afterward, Red West and Curtis himself in the single detailed account he gave years later to his brother Raymond in Knoxville. Korea, the specific difficulty of sleep that follows certain kinds of experience. The way Nashville had changed since the early 50s. The recording session that Elvis had come from that morning. A particular song they were working on that was giving him trouble. The way a song sometimes resisted the version of it you had in your head and had to be approached from a different direction. Curtis asked which song. Elvis told him. He sang 4 bars of it, quietly, not performing. Just the way a person sings a few bars of something they are working through, to hear how it sits. 2 of the other customers in the Blue Bird looked up. Patrice stopped what she was doing for a moment. Then everything resumed. They finished their eggs. Elvis asked for the check. When Patrice brought it, he looked at it and he paid for both meals and left something on the counter for Patrice that was larger than the cost of the meal. He did not make anything of this. He put on his jacket and he said it was good to meet you to Curtis, and Curtis said, likewise, and Elvis and Red West went back out into the March cold toward Music Row. Curtis Ray Holloway sat at the counter for a few more minutes. The Blue Bird had gone back to its ordinary operation. Patrice behind the counter, Gerald Foss in the back, the 2 customers at the window table talking about something unrelated to what had happened 20 minutes earlier. The counter was the counter. The coffee was the coffee. He left when he was ready. He went out onto Church Street and walked north in the March cold, with his hands in the pockets of his olive drab jacket, and he did not look back at the Blue Bird. He told his brother Raymond about it that summer, when he finally took Raymond up on the offer of the couch in Knoxville. He told it plainly, in the sequence of events, the way he told most things. Raymond listened all the way through and then he said, he just sat down. Curtis said yes. Raymond said, he didn't make a speech or anything. Curtis said no. He just sat down and ordered breakfast. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was probably exactly right. Curtis Ray Holloway got off the couch in Knoxville and into a room of his own in 1967 and into steady work, maintenance at a school, which suited him because schools were quiet in the evenings and quiet in the mornings, and there was satisfaction in the work of keeping a building functional, in the particular craft of things that needed fixing being fixed. He worked at the school for 11 years, until 1978, when his knee required surgery that the VA eventually paid for after a process that took longer than it should have. He never went back to Nashville. He lived to be 77 years old. He died in Knoxville in 1989, in the same house where Raymond lived, in a room that had been his for 22 years. A room with a window that faced the street and a radiator that worked, and a kitchen down the hall where Raymond made coffee every morning at 6:30. Raymond spoke at his funeral. He told the Blue Bird story. He told it in full, in the plain way that Curtis would have told it. The counter, the coffee cup, the man who came through the door and sat down and ordered eggs. He said, my brother spent a year at Heartbreak Ridge and never once asked anyone to recognize what that cost him. He didn't need a monument or a ceremony. He needed a man to sit down next to him at a counter and order breakfast. That was the whole of it. That was enough. The Blue Bird Café on Church Street in Nashville is not there anymore. The building was demolished in 1974 and replaced by a parking structure. There is no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate that anything of any significance happened at the counter of the establishment that stood there between 1954 and 1974. Elvis Presley returned to RCA Studio B that afternoon and worked until 8 in the evening. The session notes from that day are preserved in the RCA archives: song titles, take numbers, personnel, start and end times. They do not mention the Blue Bird or Church Street or a man named Curtis Ray Holloway or 20 minutes at a counter between 11 and 11:30 in the morning. Some things are not in the session notes. Some things are in a conversation between two brothers in Knoxville in the summer of 1966, on a couch in a house where one of them had been offering the other a place to stay for longer than either of them wanted to count. Some things are in the 4 bars of a song sung quietly at a counter, not for any audience, just to hear how it sat. Some things are in the specific shift in a man's posture when the room that was moving against him stops moving. Not visible in any photograph, not captured in any document, but real in the way that the most real things are real. In the body, in the memory, in the telling and retelling that is how the true things survive. Curtis Ray Holloway sat at a counter in Nashville in March 1966 and did not leave when he was told to. Elvis Presley walked in and sat down next to him and ordered eggs. That is the whole story. It is not a complicated story. It did not require much. It required a man to walk through a door and read a room and make a decision in the time it takes to cross from the entrance to the counter and pull out a stool and sit down. It required, in other words, the thing that Elvis Presley did most naturally in the world: noticing what a room contained and responding to what he noticed, without calculation, without ceremony, without any of the apparatus that fame usually interposes between a person and a direct human act. He sat down, he ordered breakfast, he paid the check. The room stopped moving against the man at the counter. That was enough. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who knows what it is to sit at a counter and hold your ground. Subscribe for more stories about who these people were in the moments that nobody planned to remember. And tell us in the comments, have you ever seen someone do a small, quiet thing that changed everything about a situation? The ones who sat down when everyone else looked away. Leave your story below.